this cheery topic we've been given is, why is the world effed at the moment, which is something that I have to deal with quite a lot. So for people who maybe don't know me too well, I do quite a lot of work in the defense and politics sphere for the US mostly, but the entire world is in a bit of a state, if you could probably imagine that. To start with, I think to set a bit of a tone here, if I was to ask the general public, where are the wars in the world at the moment? I might get, some of your classics. But generally, I asked my mother-in-law this the other night, and I think my mother-in-law is a pretty good gauge of where the general public sentiment is at most times, but that's what she remembered. And I'm impressed that she remembered Myanmar and Yemen, which, again, that seems like a interesting place to be. But in reality, this is where the active conflicts are going on inside the world at the moment. And these are conflicts that have had over 100 people killed by the conflict in the last effectively 12 to 24 months. Now let's add in the internal border tensions, or as in border tensions with their neighbors, where war is more likely and growing at the moment, so potential zones of problems. And now we add in coups that have been ongoing in recent times as well. And we add in internal dissident rebellions, internal crackdowns, or breakaway states within the state. So you can see that the state of the world right now is in a bit of a position. This is strange and a bit above normal. Massive endorsement for Uruguay, I guess, though, but still. Now, a lot of this is not being driven by some dark force, cabal, or anything out of the ordinary. This is actually fairly standard, and it's what we kind of model for most of the time. So let's figure out why. I've only got 15 minutes here, so I will, keeping this nice and brief, but effectively, there is a bit of a geopolitical pendulum. Right now when things are good, let's say before 2001, the pendulum doesn't move that much. The world is pretty stable. Things are pretty calm. Once you hit those problems, this pendulum starts to swing more and more. And what happens is, as things start to swing, they start to get worse and worse. And I want to explain why a bit. So I'm taking a bit of an example here, just as a, not an exact, but it gives you a bit of a idea why we see this massive upswing, particularly last year when we saw all these coups in Africa, one by one by one by one. Is it I saw a lot of news articles about this being a, deep state Russian plan to make a lot of coups. No, it's pretty standard procedure for what happens in these kind of events. So here is Eastern Ethiopia and Somalia, which has been a conflict or a turbulent zone for a while now. The blue represents Ethiopian peacekeepers, the red terrorist forces, and the yellow being civilian populations. Now, Al-Shabaab has been a force in the south of Somalia here for quite a while. That's not unusual. Now, peacekeepers have effectively been pretty good. When there's terrorist incidents in Somalia, like there was, have been for years, the Ethiopians have been able to effectively do peacekeeping operations and suppress Al-Shabaab. And that's actually, they had them pretty well suppressed there for a while. Which, again, this is what's supposed to happen in this, and particularly in Africa, but other places as well. Peacekeepers are, particularly good peacekeepers are very hard to come by. So Ethiopia in particular, as well as Rwanda now, tend to be really good peacekeepers, which, again, this is how standard stuff works when the pendulum doesn't swing that much. But then a few years later, we had the Ethiopian civil war kick off in Tigray, and effectively most of the peacekeepers were forced to divert up north, because obviously the Ethiopians are going to prioritize, defending their own territory and making sure things are stable at home over suppressing Al-Shabaab. So you can already see what the problem is, that Al-Shabaab, who, at the time had been, somewhat contained, is now gaining ground. Now, when you gain ground as a terrorist organization, you manage to get the ability to set up more road points, gain more territory, more taxable people, more income, and you actually grow as a terrorist organization. It is an exponential growth model for a lot of these things. So we've now seen, because of a war completely unrelated to Al-Shabaab, that Al-Shabaab has grown. Now we have the other problem of Al-Shabaab will, because they're growing, they have momentum, they can get more donations, they can keep this going, and they can spread their message and influence. Again, these are not exact maps. These are just kind of more to understand and explain how one conflict can effectively breed another. So what you also find is if the government or central government can't control and they can't get peacekeepers in to protect people, as we can see on the map here, civilians flee. And that's fairly understandable. As much as I'm sure Somalia has some lovely coastline, I don't think I would want to stick around too long for it. So they flee into Kenya, which is exactly what happened when these peacekeepers left. Now, what happens then is it puts massive pressure on the Kenyan population, particularly in those areas of the country in the east, where resources are short and everything's already a breaking point, which effectively means that when you put these massive additional population in all at once, it breaks the infrastructure in the local area. The government is also the national government is then forced to either A, admit it hasn't got control out there, which is never good. B, push out the refugees, to which that offsets any good relations you have with your neighbors and will effectively stop any terrorist coordination. Or C, allow those refugees to exist within the country, which puts pressure on the resources, which then breeds terrorist units. Because if you haven't got any water or you haven't got any rice coming through that used to be, you lose your faith in the local government or institution. So we've just seen here how a unrelated conflict in Tigray has effectively not only allowed the Al-Shabaab forces in Somalia to gain ground, but also bred an entirely new rebellion movement in Kenya. And this is what happens around the world, that we see when one coup goes down or one war happens, that it breeds other wars because it puts pressure on the surrounding states, particularly states that are at a fragility point when we go into this. Now, add to that, we've got a whole bunch of coups. And again, this is just in the last 2 years. So that's just in the last 2 years. And that should give you an idea on why things are going the way they are. Effectively, some of these coups are, standard bar for the course. I think the Germany coup was absolutely hilarious. It was a bunch of guys who had ties to the old German royal family who thought they could bring the Kaiser back, which I have no idea how they thought that would work, but still. But we can see here that if one coup is successful in Africa, it tends to bring coups around it because people go, oh, well, okay, that government institution is broken. People have lost faith and go, oh, there is something that can change. It makes it easier for the next one to knock over as well. And it's why we saw these coups, particularly through the Sahel belt, one after the other, after the other, after the other. And this is the trouble we're having, that now the pendulum is moving too fast. Things are speeding up a little bit. So we've also got all of these border disputes currently escalating in the last 12 months as well. And some of those are very old, ancient ones that, we kind of watch, something like the top of that islands there, the Coral Islands, is between Japan and Russia since the Second World War. Something that very rarely comes up, but it's something that Russia will use to antagonize and go for it. And again, it's one of those things that usually you give it a 1 in 200 chance of things going wrong when you roll the dice. But now, as tensions grow, it starts to get to 1 to 70, which again is where we're at. Oh, another one. So let's talk about the top 5 drivers, and I'll end with this, then I'll go to a bit of Q&A. Let's keep it nice and short for everyone here today because I do know it's Saturday night. So the top 5 flashpoints most people in defense are looking at the moment are: 1, Russia wins the war in Ukraine with no consequences. And effectively, this is the biggest one. And it's the reason why people ask, why should we be fighting in Ukraine? Why should we be doing this? It's because right now we've spent the last, let's say, since World War II, for 80 years, existing in a, for lack of a better word, rules-based order. But mostly it's because we've agreed that the lines on the map, where they're drawn, that's where the lines are. And we do not change them by aggression. We only change them via, referendum, country splitting apart, that kind of stuff. And that's where it's been. Now, again, that's really sad for map makers and, a lot of countries around the world. But it does mean that we've avoided wars because, as we saw with Yugoslavia, as we see with a lot of border redraws, the moment people think, okay, wherever the borders are drawn in 6 months, that's where the lines will be for the next 100 years. Let's go get some more ground. And that's where you have real aggressive, nasty wars kick off. If Russia were to redraw the borders with no consequences, it would send and we've already seen it. Armenia is looking at redrawing the lines. Algeria, Morocco are looking at redrawing lines. Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan are really looking at redrawing lines. It is it effectively opens Pandora's box for we can redraw lines. And that is not a place that anyone wants to be. Second one is China attempts to seize Kinmen or Taiwan. I can go through a little bit more of that if need be. But effectively, this is the big one that everyone worries about, because if we thought the Russians, having to effectively Europe having to get off Russian gas was a problem, holy mother of Lord, trying to get off Chinese materials would be even worse. So it's why we're seeing this massive effort from not only US partners and allied partners in Australia as well, to effectively send a giant message to Xi Jinping of do not try to take Taiwan. Because if he does, that is, I don't think he can take it, but it will force everyone to cut Chinese materials, which causes massive shocks, both economically and geopolitically across the world. Israel drags Iran or the US into a war. That is very much a concern at the moment. I'm not going to burn and make not upset too many people by going too far into this one, but yes, that is a big concern at the moment, that this war escalates, as it will. There's a lot of trade routes. There's a lot of different interests that will be put at play in that one. The second one is economic pressures and the reduction of FDI. This is one that sort of the people like me who are sonified, depressed Excel spreadsheets of people will mostly look at. But right now we are seeing a trend, particularly from the richer nations, of putting money in safer places. The market is not doing as well as it was. People are panicking on these amount of coups, and all these countries where, that $400 million investment in the gas terminal or port that they were building is now being cancelled. Particularly if a country like Equatorial Guinea, where Chevron is not renewing their contract, that is 80% of the economy disappearing in 2027. 80%, that's a terrifying place to be in. Now we are watching more and more countries, as the economy gets worse, pulling money away from less safe countries. And that is going to have massive effects on the smaller states, which again, short term, these companies go, oh, no problem. Who cares? It's Equatorial Guinea. But Equatorial Guinea blows into Guinea blows into DRC, and so on and so forth. And the last one is the US election goes badly. I won't say which side I'm barracking for, but there's one that terrifies me. There is a particular concern amongst a lot of European defense partners, about what happens if the US election goes one way over the other. And this is something that we're all watching very, very closely. We don't know how bad it could be. We don't know if it could be, but we do know that the second term will probably be a bit crazier than the first. So this is a big concern, whether win, lose, or draw. If Biden wins, then yes, it's going to be, the Trump movement is not going to disappear. There's still going to be problems. Trump wins. There was massive, I don't want to say too much, but there was, State Department had a real tough time on that particular run. We don't know who would be Secretary of State. And if it goes badly or it's a draw or contested result, well, that's, not good for anyone either. So in November, effectively, there are so many countries around the world just watching November, particularly the Russians, to see how things react. And it's interesting, I'll leave you on this kind of inside scoop tidbit here, but when you do war games with Department of Defense or with US Navy College or any of those guys, we can model what Biden will do in a Taiwan scenario, in most scenarios. It's fairly easy to model. We can't model Trump very well because his decisions could depend day to day. And that is the terrifying part of this, is that when you model for Biden, it's a standard, escalation model. It's a standard playbook. You know what's going to happen. You can predict it. You can work with the Chinese team to make sure this doesn't end up in nuclear war. With Trump, you're rolling dice. Not that I have a side that I pick. So that is if I were to put it mildly, that would be the top 5 flashpoints I would be watching at the moment.